Hi, my name is Alexandria, and I chose the topic schizophrenia. The podcast that I listen to is called What is Schizophrenia? Inside Schizophrenia, and is hosted by Rachel Starwithers and co-hosted by Gabe Howard. The podcast first discusses the false assumptions of what schizophrenia essentially looks like. Typically, schizophrenia in movies and TV shows is portrayed as people who are not in control of their own life and are usually depicted as drooling, rocking back and forth, and are generally psychotic people who need to be hospitalized. This is not always a true depiction of schizophrenia. In fact, it is a very small percentage of people with schizophrenia that are in a state of mental disorder for a long duration of time, as it is commonly a passing state of mental disturbances. So a common movie that they talked about, or a popular movie that they talked about, is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Bird Box. These two movies I believe are both on Netflix, but they are very popular movies, and in these movies the people with schizophrenia in them are in a manic state for basically the whole duration of the movie, which leads us to believe that people with schizophrenia are not in control of their lives for a long period of time, basically their whole lives, and they need to be hospitalized or they need somebody to take care of them. And this is just not true, and the podcast goes on to explain why, which is Rachel, who is the main host. She actually has schizophrenia. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia in her 20s, and goes on to tell us how she has a great, perfectly normal life. She has a job, she has a great social life, and her disorder doesn't really affect her as it used to. So what exactly is schizophrenia? The podcast defines schizophrenia and is characterized by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech and thoughts that cause social or occupational dysfunction. This definition may seem like it goes hand in hand with how schizophrenia is depicted on TV or in movies or shows like the ones I've just discussed. But the podcast goes on to explain how oftentimes people with schizophrenia, often who are in recovery, experience and live a normal life. This means that they are in control and can navigate when they are experiencing a schizophrenic episodes versus when they are not. To touch on what recovery means in regards to schizophrenia, the podcast describes this as people who are utilizing medication to control their schizophrenic behavior or actively getting psychiatric help, which I was a little bit confused on. I kind of thought when we hear the word recovery, we think they're like, they no longer have schizophrenia, or, they're kind of past that whole hurdle, but that's just not true. They've just learned to cope with it. They've developed coping mechanisms, which typically is from the help of psychiatric help, and they're taking medication or a variation of both. Every person differs, so finding a routine and medication that works is often a time-consuming process, but overall, those who are in recovery are able to live controlled and normal lives, just like Rachel in the podcast talks about her normal job, her normal life. She does experience schizophrenic symptoms, such as like she hears voices and whatnot, but she's able to tell herself like this is not real, and she can ignore it and it won't send her into a full episode. So the podcast also goes on to differentiate what hallucinations and delusions are, which is something I needed a little help with. Delusions are ideas or beliefs that you form without any rational explanation. A common one that they use as an example is people who feel like the FBI is out to get them, or the FBI is watching them all the time. Like there's no rational explanation as to why they think this, they just think it. And then I just talked about delusions. Hallucinations are things that you can smell, see, and feel, but they are not actually there. And then another topic that was very popular in this podcast was schizophrenia and violence. Also, these movies tend to make us believe that people with schizophrenia are very violent people. Like we said, they're not in control of their life, so they're violent, they act out, but that's just also not true. It's typically because they see things or hear things that aren't there, and they're defending themselves as any rational person would if they thought something was serious and real, and it just is not. So then it goes on to talk about how treatment and therapy, medications, and support from others all alleviate the struggles of what schizophrenia brings. So now I'm going to kind of talk about why I chose this topic. I chose this topic because I work with special ed students for part of the week, and more specifically, I work with a student who I kind of felt showed some schizophrenic tendencies. Of course, I'm not a doctor and I can't diagnose a student, but she does tend to act kind of the way we talked about in movies that we always think is a true depiction of schizophrenia. So that was my first thought, was like, I feel like this student has schizophrenia. Well, being that I work closely with her, I thought it'd be beneficial to learn more about this disorder and maybe learn about some ways that I can help her learn in a beneficial way. When I listened to the podcast, I came to find that what I've learned versus what is popularized on TV and whatnot, they're very different. The facts are very different. I came to find that maybe the student more specifically shows occasional signs of schizophrenia, but mostly shows signs of multiple personality disorder. And the more I began to learn about schizophrenia, the more interested I began to become due to the reality of what people with schizophrenia experience in comparison to what we are shown on TV. Then I'm going to talk about something I found interesting after the podcast. One major fact that I found interesting was that's how people with schizophrenia show symptoms that are not linked to schizophrenia but stem from medications. I found this interesting because I feel like people who show symptoms or whatnot and they have a disorder, people generally kind of just mesh them together and say like, oh, that's part of the symptoms come from that disorder, but that's just not always true. Medications tend to bring a lot of symptoms that can be misconstrued as symptoms of the disorder. I have found that medications play a huge role in many ways and sometimes can cause negative effects or physical effects that we can see that kind of draw lines together. Something I think differently about listening to this podcast is the true reality of schizophrenia and how there are many people with this disorder who can live normal lives. I kind of talked about this in the beginning about how like we think that the people with schizophrenia are kind of like disorderly, they are not in control, but Rachel Starr states that many people never know she has schizophrenia until she shares that information with him. In the beginning, she kind of asks Gabe, like, do you think I'm schizophrenic? And that's an odd question to ask somebody, so he's like, no, of course not, like thrown off by it. But her question, or the reasoning behind the question, is people typically think like in these movies you can see right away, kind of like me with my student. I kind of thought you could see right away and know the signs right away, but because pop culture shows it one way and we learn it a different way, there's a kind of like an imbalance there. She also shares with us that the disorder does not prevent her from physically or mentally doing things throughout life. Although it is difficult to find the different routines and medications that help this disorder, once that roadblock is passed, people with this disorder are able to go on and live fully controlled lives and understand when they are having episodes, which I thought was very interesting too. This is kind of her coping mechanism that she figured out and kind of developed whenever she experiences like schizophrenic episodes. Kind of she hears voices, or hears not specific voices, but she hears someone calling her name. And instead of letting that send her into a full manic state, she'll stop and say like, that's not real. And same with like faces. She said she sees people's facial features will move around their face, which, you know, could be very scary, but now she's learned to just, when she sees it happening, just tell herself it's not real, and she'll continue about her day, and she's completely fine now with that situation. But there are people who, when they're not in recovery and are aware of, you know, their diagnosis and whatnot, that can be a very scary thing and can send you into a full manic episode. And she also talks about when you aren't aware, there's no reasoning. You can't tell somebody like, that's not real. They won't believe you. It's in their head that it's already a real situation. So then I'm going to talk about a question that I had that was not discussed in the podcast. My question was, what did the diagnosis process consist of? I feel like they didn't discuss this too much in the podcast because they discussed the emotional side of the pre-diagnosis that Rachel kind of went through versus and they also talked about her after diagnosis, but it was mostly the emotional side. Like, how did she deal with that? How did her family deal with it? Was it hard for her? Kind of stuff like that. But they didn't talk about what exactly she went through, like the process and the steps. So I kind of wanted to know a little bit about that. I found that according to Diagnosing Schizophrenia, an online article from NYU Langone Health, the diagnosis begins with a physical examination and then thoroughly reviews the patient's medical, psychiatric, and family history. After that, they then have their patient explain and describe their experiences, usually their traumatic experiences. While doing this, the doctor is able to look for key symptoms of schizophrenia. There are other symptoms, but the main symptoms that they commonly look for are delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized and disorderly speech, kind of what we talked about in the beginning. And they will typically follow up with MRI scans, blood tests. It's done due to medications, like we talked about, that can cause these schizophrenic-like symptoms. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my career goal. My career goal is to become an elementary school teacher. In the podcast, Rachel Starr discussed her pre-diagnosed life and how none of her family members really knew much about schizophrenia, so they didn't really have the means to help her, and honestly they didn't think it would have been schizophrenia based off of, like we said, the TV shows and everything else like that. They just didn't see it. They thought, where's the line between what schizophrenia is and, just having a wild imagination? That's kind of what they thought in that situation. So having knowledge regarding this topic will benefit me by being able to identify when a younger student may be experiencing similar disorders or disorders in general. It doesn't just have to be schizophrenia, but although I cannot diagnose a student, I'm not a doctor or anything like that, I think it does benefit a family to be able to say that I've noticed some instances where your student is experiencing moments that may be needing you to look further into. If a teacher had said these things to Rachel, I think she may have been diagnosed at a younger age, and I think it's very important to have, clear communication with your families and be able to say, hey, I'm not a doctor, I don't know, but I have noticed this, this, and this, and I think it's important that you look into it. And I think that helps a lot of families. Overall, I feel like this podcast was very beneficial in explaining what schizophrenia is and how it differs from person to person rather than the standard representation that pop culture provides us with. Thank you.